The first thing that we should say about intersectional theory is that at best, it's an incredibly oversimplistic view of the world. It's very, very low resolution. And at worst, it's just not true. This whole thing is a flawed concept from the very beginning. For example, let's take a look at this idea that men are inherently more privileged than women by sheer virtue of being male. In 2019, a team of scientists carried out a global study across 134 different countries, 6.8 billion people, to determine the levels of hardship and discrimination that are present for men and women in each one. To present their findings, they compiled a database called the Basic Index of Gender Inequality. And once all the data had been inputted, they discovered that men are actually more disadvantaged and face greater hardship than women in 91 of those countries, while women are more disadvantaged in just 43. This means that men, according to the study, actually face more daily hardship in more countries across the world than women do. And this was noted to be especially true in the West. Now, a lot of people are going to be asking, well, how can this be? This is not the narrative we're used to. This can't possibly be true. And that's largely because men's struggles are underreported. They're not talked about in the same way. So let's dig into some areas where men are discriminated against and generally have it worse. And let's start with school, right back at the beginning. A lot of research on education has shown that schools are now primarily geared towards the advancement of girls, and this is often to the expense of boys. Indeed, even when boys score as well or better than girls in standardized tests, they often still get lower grades from teachers. A major study looked into why boys were being undervalued and discriminated and discovered that basically teachers find boys' behavior to be more annoying. Boys fidget more in class and seem less attentive, and teachers, the majority of whom are female, around 77%, subconsciously seem to factor this into their grading. Psychologist Michael Thompson has noted that these days, girl behavior is the gold standard in schools. Boys are treated like defective girls. One male teacher, speaking from personal experience, many years actually, he was, I think, retired by the time he said this. Most teachers in grade school are female. All teachers want their students to behave in class. Male teachers see boys' behavior as normal and humorous. One student during a class discussion raised his hand and said, "Hey, Mr. Phone, you have a great point there." I thanked him, but then he added, "But if you wear a hat, nobody would notice." I clapped in laughter, so did the class. Male teachers have great camaraderie with boy students. Female teachers, on the other hand, want boys to act like girls in class. Sit up straight, pay attention, don't wriggle around, be quiet, be dutiful. In other words, female teachers expect the boys to be sugar and spice and everything nice, but boys are snips and snails and puppy dog tails, and some female teachers don't want that. That's why boys get sent to the principal's office far, far more often than girls. Due to this annoyance with boyish behavior, the researchers found that teachers often rated boys as less proficient, even when the boys were doing just as well as the girls in reading, math, and science. They discovered that when the teachers were asked to grade the papers anonymously, not knowing the identity or sex of the student, the boys would receive higher scores, thus showing there's a subconscious discrimination against them in the grading process. And as a result of the female-centric education, boys now do get lower grades. They receive fewer honours and are far less likely to go to college than girls. Boys earn 70% of the D's and F's in school exams. They only earn 40% of the A's. Boys are 50% more likely than girls to be held back a grade, are over twice as likely to be suspended, and nearly 3 times as likely to be expelled. Of high school dropouts, 80% are males. Boys are 95% more likely to be diagnosed as hyperactive, and therefore boys are 70% more likely to be medicated at school age. These troubles through school mean that just 41% of US college students are now male, and for every 100 women that graduate college, only 74 men will. Now, as they grow up, as they graduate, as they enter the workforce, men will be expected to take on more of the dangerous jobs in the world than women. And because of this, men are 20 times more likely to have a fatal injury at work. The 10 most dangerous jobs in the world are logging, aircraft piloting and flight engineering, roofing, iron and steel work, garbage and waste collection, mining, truck driving, farming, and agricultural work, and fishing and construction. Overwhelmingly, these jobs are carried out by men, often in places 90+% of the workforce in these jobs are going to be men. Indeed, although men make up half of America's workforce, they make up 90% of workplace fatalities. Perhaps the most dangerous job that they'll be asked to perform in their lifetime is serving their country in combat. 84% of soldiers in the military are male, and this feeds into a wider and more general notion that a man's life is simply more disposable than a woman's. It's not worth as much as a woman's life, something called the male expendability theory. The theory says that from a reproductive standpoint, the lives of males are simply of less concern to a population than those of females because they're less necessary for population replacement. Therefore, anytime a dangerous situation emerges with a potential loss of life, men are expected to be the ones to put themselves on the front line and basically sacrifice themselves for the good of all. For example, when an intruder enters a family home, it's the man who's expected to confront them, putting his life at risk to defend those inside. Traditionally, when a man and woman were walking side by side on a street pavement, the man was expected to walk on the outside, on the roadside, so that he would be the first one to take the hit if any cars veered off course. When the Titanic sank, 73% of women survived, but only 19% of men survived. And this was due to the social convention that said that women and children should get priority access to the lifeboats, women and children first, because their lives simply mattered more than the men's lives. Indeed, whenever a tragedy is reported on the news, even to this day, and when it involves loss of life, special mention will often be made whenever there are women and children involved. There was a tragedy today. Lots of people lost their lives, many of whom were women and children. That's what they'll say. The inference being that if it were only men who had died, it would be a less sad or significant occasion. If men get into trouble with the law, they will find the law courts are biased against them as well in the West. Men receive harsher punishments than women for the exact same crime, something called sentencing disparity. Globally, 93% of the prison population are male, and this is partly because men are twice as likely as women to be sentenced to jail after a conviction, and on average they receive 63% longer jail sentences than women. 29% of male first-time offenders are sentenced to custody, while only 17% of female first-time offenders are. Men have a 62% chance of being bailed, while women have an 80% chance. On average, men will serve 53% of their sentence, while women will serve 5% less. Divorce courts also tend to massively favor women. In the United States, after divorce, women will win child custody rights 90% of the time, and this means that fathers are sometimes completely cut off from their children. Who gets to keep the house after a divorce is closely linked to child custody, meaning that courts will typically award that to the woman as well. Very often she'll be granted some kind of monthly maintenance payment from the man too. Therefore, divorce tends to impact men much harder than women in general. They'll lose their kids, their house, and a lot of their money. Men will then tend to experience greater health declines and report lower feelings of well-being afterwards, according to a key study by the University of Amsterdam. They'll be at higher risk of adopting bad coping strategies like alcohol or drugs. They'll have an elevated mortality risk, and they'll report greater feelings of loneliness and social isolation. If things really fall apart for a man, there are less safety nets to catch him in society and to give him some kind of support. Therefore, according to the housing charity Crisis, 84% of the hidden homeless population in the UK are male. Furthermore, 9 out of 10 of people sleeping rough are male. Perhaps the most striking statistic that highlights the struggles men face, though, is in regard to suicide. 74% of all suicides in the UK and 79% of all suicides in the US are committed by men, and it's the second leading cause of death among young males in particular. The idea that men have historically been advantaged with power and used it to subjugate women is a false, embittered feminist trope. Men and women both have their struggles. They're different struggles, but they both have unique struggles. Look into the eyes of men who fought in the trenches of World War I, or who stormed the beaches of Normandy in World War II, or who've spent their lives down mine shafts, or spent it rescuing people from burning buildings, and tell them that they're just callous exploiters. Tell that to the men who willingly froze in icy waters when the Titanic sank so their wives and children could live. Or look into the eyes of a homeless man and tell him he's privileged just because he's a man. This is why I say that intersectional theory is oversimplified and simply wrong. As Camille Paglia says, men are often used as disposable, dispensable slaves to higher powers. Men have sacrificed and crippled themselves physically and emotionally to feed, house, and protect women and children. None of their pain or achievement is registered in feminist rhetoric, which only portrays men as oppressors and callous exploiters. The myth of male privilege has been laid bare in recent years by some unlikely people. Nora Vincent was a lesbian journalist who'd been convinced for many years by this woke idea that men are inherently more privileged and women inherently more oppressed. And she intended to prove it by crossing the divide. In 2003, she went undercover as a man called Ned with the intention to write a book about her experiences. She cut her hair short, hired a makeup artist to give her stubble, worked out to gain more muscle mass. She even enlisted the help of a Juilliard vocal coach to learn how to talk with a deeper voice. After living as a man for 18 months, she gave this report of her experiences. While all of us in the post-feminist movement are convinced that women have always had it worse and men have always had it better, it took me stepping into their shoes to realise that that's not true at all. My experience was one that made me feel very vulnerable and made me feel a lot of pain and difficulty.
But her views about men have changed forever.
Men are suffering. They have different problems than women have, but they don't have it better. They need our sympathy, they need our love, and they need each other more than anything else. They need to be together.
Do you think women understand what it's like to be a man?
Not at all. No clue. No idea.
Nora was so depressed by the shattering of her intersectional worldview that while writing her book, Self-Made Man, she checked into a mental health facility and eventually committed suicide. In 2023, a transgender man, that is a woman living as a man, went viral on social media when she spoke of similar struggles. She created a TikTok video describing how traumatic life had been in the 8 years since she started living as a man.
Nobody told me how lonely being a man is. I had closer friendships with random women I met in the bathroom before I transitioned at clubs because of how open women are than I've had in my 8 years of transitioning, because women are just so much more vulnerable and deep than men. But to have known, and I think a lot of trans men feel this, is we knew what depth felt like before we transitioned. We knew what it felt like to have people want to hug us and to have people want to talk to us and to have a community. And then you transition and you're just a guy walking down the street that people cross the street so that they're not near you. And friendships are so much harder to build. And people are colder. But I also now understand why the suicide rate is so much higher in men. Because this is lonely. And I'm an emotionally mature man. I know how to build friendships, and it is still really, really hard. Try to think about how you can, in your small little community where you feel safe, can reach out to the men in your life and just help them feel maybe seen for a moment.
The woke, because of their adherence to intersectionality and because they need it to be true to justify their hatred and their bitterness of men, will often declare that men are, by sheer virtue of their sex, always in a position of power and privilege, and they have life so much easier. The reality, though, as proven by women who have actually tried to walk in men's shoes, is that men are no more privileged than women are. Both sexes experience different challenges, face different hardships, and are each discriminated against in their own ways. For example, I've heard it said that men will never understand how vulnerable women feel on a daily basis, but women will never understand how disposable men feel on a daily basis. And this isn't some kind of competition. This isn't a victimhood Olympics where we each compete as to which sex is worse off. That's what intersectionality would like to do, but that's not what this is about. This is simply to say that intersectional theory itself is a flawed and bitter idea that causes needless anger and hatred and bitterness and rancor between the sexes. Rather than trying to pit the sexes against one another, as intersectionality does, we'd be far better off following the Bible's teaching on this, which says, sympathise with each other, love each other as brothers and sisters, be tender-hearted, and keep a humble attitude. That's a far better way to live. Not tearing one another down, but trying to sympathise with one another, understanding one another, being tender-hearted and humble about the struggles that we each uniquely face as men and women in this world.